So as you heard, and it's true, I'm both a poet and an internist, and like my hero, the essential American poet William Carlos Williams, who was also a general internist, I work at the intersection of human suffering and our constant struggle to tell its story. And I believe that we are not only our physical bodies, we are equally our words and our imaginations. So to begin, a bit of a personal story of my own. When I first contemplated becoming a physician, I thought I was really unlikely to succeed. I thought first about my faith and not seeing much of a spiritual life among physicians. I thought that might be a kind of challenge for me. Then I considered my ethnic identity and not having many Latino role models to inspire me to enter the profession. I thought that might be another kind of barrier. And then it's the fact that I'm gay, and I thought after experiencing a lot of homophobia in doctors' offices at a pretty young age, that might be the biggest barrier I might have in becoming a physician. And as it turned out, when I finally became a medical student here in Boston, it was the fact that I was a poet that was so problematic. All these other issues, certainly did pose some difficulties, some challenges, but being a poet really freaked out my colleagues and my attendings. And I always reflect back on that with a sense of the tremendous irony there, because here were all these incredible scientists thinking about how we can quantify pain on a 1 to 10 scale and cloning the opioid receptors in our brains, but there wasn't really attention to the human experience of suffering that I think poetry really, and other kinds of narratives really allows us to engage much more effectively. And so I think that's even perhaps more true in these particularly divisive and troubling times, and especially in regards to the opioid epidemic. So in addition to my clinical practice, caring for a diverse group of patients that include many Latinos and LGBTQ people, people with HIV and AIDS, and also, of course, people with substance abuse disorder, which cuts across all of these identities and categories. And as Michael mentioned, there's obviously lots of overlap among these communities and identities. I'm also a medical educator who is steeped in the notion of the health humanities or the medical humanities. And so I think a lot about how we can employ narratives and stories in working with medical trainees to teach what I think many of my fellow faculty consider in some sense unteachable. Central aspects to the work of healing, such as empathy and compassion, service and altruism, professionalism and ethical medical practice, cross-cultural awareness, the social determinants of disease and health disparities, and spirituality, the end of life, and the nature of pain and suffering. I'm also interested in studying the impact of the humanities not only in medical education, but also on the doctor-patient relationship and on actual disease outcomes. And there's actually growing scientific evidence that suggests that storytelling may help prevent the erosion of empathy that we see in our medical trainees, that it can help practicing doctors become more effective communicators in clinical encounters, that it can help foster resilience in the midst of rising concerns about physician burnout and high rates of substance abuse in the medical profession, and that ultimately may actually even help our patients cope with pain and symptoms, and maybe healing therapeutic in its own right. So how does it work? Here are some possibilities. I think poetry allows us to be more fully present in the experience of pain and suffering, offering in response to fear and anxiety the relief of the imagination. That unquantifiable 1 to 10 pain scale becomes somehow more fathomable and bearable through metaphoric language. I think poetry invites us to be present in the ambiguity, uncertainty, but when we can't diagnose the cause of pain, or when pain is not just physical but also experienced emotionally in ways medicine can't fully measure or explain. Where pain tends to silence us, taking our breath away, poetry famously can speak the unspeakable. By abetting empathy, poetry can help break down barriers between doctors and our patients, especially people living with substance use disorder, whom we often regard unidimensionally as hateful or single-mindedly drug-seeking. Poetry and storytelling might provide a comforting sense of control or containment, or even simple naming of pain when there isn't another analgesic to try. Poetry also represents beauty, which in turn inspires in us a desire to create, to renew ourselves. Our pain is by nature at odds with itself. We say it hurts so good, or no pain, no gain. And what else but poetry, as another esteemed American poet, Stanley Kunitz, said, can help us believe two contradictory ideas at once. Thus it is in poetry we find our compulsion to make immortalizing art that at the same time subsumes ourselves, and we discover our wish to indulge in the wild pleasures of language, and yet to be redeemed in the call to viscerally shared experience. So that's just a brief introduction to some poems I want to share, some of mine and some by people who are living with addiction or who are in recovery or both. And hopefully I can enact and perhaps perform to some extent some of what I've just touched on, and also some of the themes in Michael's presentation. Why does narrative actually matter? How do these personal stories really move us? How do they change how we think? So this first poem I want to share is one that wonders at the tension between the medical gaze that attempts to objectify and dehumanize illness, and art's treatment of suffering as inherently embedded in cultures and histories, both personal and societal. And I remember always vividly how I was told over and over again during my own medical training to focus on the medical facts, just the facts. What I could capture and measure with my sort of medical jargon, which I was fast absorbing, and really to desensitize myself to the truths of how my patients actually lived with pain and with illness and with suffering. And I think that, as Michael suggested, the more rigorous study of addiction medicine has in many ways helped us to destigmatize those who live with substance use disorder. I think, that formal diagnosis itself can function as kind of a repudiation of those negative terms like junkie and addict that we typically apply to people living with the condition. We also still, I think, if we make it solely a medical diagnosis, we risk, losing sight of the distinguishing human features of our patients who are living with the disease. And those human characteristics, I think, really do abet in us empathy and compassion and the desire to treat someone differently than we might otherwise. So this is a poem that I hope perhaps enact some of those tensions, if you will. It's called Afraid of the Dark. And yes, I am going to read poetry, so hopefully no one will run screaming out of the auditorium. Afraid of the dark. A black man in the ER waits for me. I take my time because the sign out says he's homeless, alcoholic, probably a shooter too, complaining of 3 days of headache, fever not quite 102, a cough, and short of breath. It's either AIDS or just another boring case of flu. A list of other diagnoses fades as I catch sight of him, half hidden by the puke-stained yellow curtain. He looks fine, my intern gripes. A disembodied cry suggests the possibility of pain. I notice all the doctors here are white, while nearly all the patients that we treat are black or brown. He stares back wearily, as though he knows the next experiment in which he's made the subject has to be as flawed as all the others. Once we've spent a couple minutes on his history, we'll fill the gaps ourselves. It's time to find a vein. The Great Society, Tuskegee, Martin Luther King. Though blind, my stick surprises me with how his blood so briskly flows, as if by force of habit. My intern asks me whether we'll exclude immunocompromise. I bet he has it, she crows. But I am thinking of his eyes, the blankness of a hope not realized. So I want to contrast that biomedical voice with a poem by an emerging younger Appalachian poet, William Brewster, whose first book is called I Know You're Kind, and it addresses his own personal experiences of addiction and recovery. In teaching this poem to my medical students and interns and residents, I'm always struck by how the speaker's use of positive metaphoric language humanizes him in their eyes. They see their own challenges and aspirations in his struggle to literally move through the familiar door of the depersonalized clinic towards self-fulfillment and healing. As you'll see, the speaker also invokes community in the waiting room, counting himself as an addict, which serves as an antidote to the rejection, shame, and isolation that can so often derail treatment of substance use disorder and also recovery. So this is a poem by William Brewer, which is called Leaving the Pain Clinic. Always this warm moment when I forgot which part of me I blamed. Never mind the pills kicking in, their spell that showers the waiting room, once full of shame, in a soft rain of sparks that pity sometimes is. How it mends the past like a welder seams metal. And isn't that why we're all here, addicts and arthritics? We close our eyes completely, but the edges only blur. And though the door's the same, somehow the exit, like the worst wounds, is greater than the entrance was. I throw it open for all to see how daylight, so tall, has imagination. It has heart. It loves. So I think a humanities-based approach to addiction and recovery certainly allows a wider field of investigation into how we respond to people with substance use disorder in clinical settings, whom we often regard reflexively with suspicion, disdain, and outright contempt, again, as Michael was suggesting. In particular, an understanding of the notion of narrative contract becomes a useful tool in helping care providers to confront the feelings of mistrust and anger upon which such counterproductive responses are based. We can provide a space where we can discuss what kinds of language and behavior lead us to feel manipulated, such as when our sense of authority and control is challenged by appeals to our suppressed emotions. We can also give voice to those suppressed feelings of frustration by acknowledging that sometimes our interactions with hateful or difficult patients are colored by past breaches of trust. Once identified and expressed, we can then seek insights into what in turn may drive our patients to disrupt the standard conventions of the doctor-patient relationship in which we are so invested. So in this next short poem, I depict my own imperfect response to one such fraught encounter as an entree into reflecting on how one might engage maybe more humanely. Accepting our own shortcomings and our deviations from the norms and expectations of our professional lives may help us to be more forgiving of the transgressions of our patients without pretending that they don't occur. So this is from a series of poems called Alternative Medicine, and it's a very short poem called IVDU. IVDU. I envy you, he says. You got it all figured. I stare at the computer screen. IVDU, that means I'm on dope, right? Just an addict, right? Silently, I type. You got to write me a prescription, man. IVDU, AIDS. That's AIDS. Can't you just be happy I'm going to die and give me my damn prescription? I try to hate him, but write Percocet instead. Now that didn't hurt much, did it? He asks. The acclaimed poet Kim Adonisio has written extensively about her own experiences related to drug and alcohol use. This next poem from her collection, Jimmy and Rita, is a stunning rejoinder to the most popular and prevalent narratives about opioid use, that we're in the midst of a crisis, that we've declared a war on drugs, that indeed all drugs are of the illicit and pharmaceutical type. Here, the speaker unabashedly celebrates the powerful allure of our larger drug culture, ironically demonstrating our fascination with how it mixes and confuses desire and death, sensuality and intoxication, wanton abandon and solemn hope, self-loathing and redemption. By drawing us into the visceral experience of her conflicted love poem, embracing us even as her title sneers at us, she reveals our shared humanity, engendering in us a profound empathy, making it almost impossible for us to see the addict as somehow just the other, or not me. So this is Kim's poem, "You Don't Know What Love Is." You don't know what love is, but you know how to raise it in me, like a dead girl winched up from a river. How to wash off the sludge, the stench of our past. How to start clean. This love even sits up and blinks. Amazed, she takes a few shaky steps. Any day now, she'll try to eat solid food. She'll want to get into a fast car, one low to the ground, and drive to some cinder block shithole in the desert where she can drink and get sick and then dance in nothing but her underwear. You know where she's headed. You know she'll wake up with an ache she can't locate, and no money, and a terrible thirst. So to hell with your warm hand sliding inside my shirt and your tongue down my throat like an oxygen tube. Cover me in black plastic. Let the mourners through. I think one of the most complicating and compelling narratives surrounding opioid use is the one that casts it as self-destructive choice and thus an abdication of personal responsibility, again, as Michael was discussing. This particular narrative often arises not only among care providers, but also among many family members and in the neighborhoods and communities most impacted by drugs, who see themselves as unacknowledged victims. And there's just an article actually in the New York Times that I think Michael was also referring to that showed some of this kind of tension between communities who feel in some sense invaded by drug users who are at the same time being approached with more effective treatments and the conflict that arises around that. I think to simply dismiss or deride such stories of a different kind of pain as unfeeling or selfish or cynical only serves to further fuel them. Instead, honestly grappling with the questions of what is choice and where responsibility lies may more productively engage those who seem opposed to treating addicts with the dignity and respect they view as undeserved. I wrote this next poem in the spirit of remystifying and perhaps thereby disarming a choice we can't entirely biomedically explicate, nor fully fathom emotionally or even spiritually, or even really understand as a choice. So this is a poem called Addiction Medicine. Do trees crave sunshine? Could the neighbor's boy not live with his dreams of paradise? I'd watch him peering out his window, sky above him, blue and innocent, like it might really break his fall. I promised that I'd never touch the stuff again, but light has this way of lying to you, betraying you, telling you your mind is not decaying, that you're not really crazy to be seeing things, beauty maybe even hope. I need to get my hands on some good dope, he said, while elsewhere in the ER, hips or sometimes hearts lay broken. Suffering is just we're always seeking one damn thing. Call it what you will, addiction, the song of the sirens, or whatever else it is we somehow lost. Like night aches for stars, this sharp needle yearns for awful bliss. And here's another poem by the award-winning and I think mind-blowing queer African-American poet, Deaconess Smith, that provides another kind of questioning of the notions of choice and responsibility in relation to drug use. As in Adenizio's poem, though perhaps more explicitly here, the speaker's oppressed position in relation to the structural powers that be compels him to seek a kind of relief that is at once surrender and freedom, fearing and dreaming, dying and yet living. And so this is Deaconess's poem, Surrender. What do I forfeit when I ask him to choke me? When I vote for a white mayor? When I pay my taxes and the cops keep needing no reason but a fear to kill people of particular skins? I am a man of particular addictions. What my mother calls God, I call smoke, or call on Thursdays to submit to, or some call safety, rock, water, gin, white girl, money, Allah, meth, whatever you call your tether. Tonight, I want to burn the tether, see if I fly or drown. No. Tonight, I want to be bound until I become the binding. Yes. Tonight, I want to give myself over. Come, sir. Come, honey. Come, drug. Come, officer. I'm wearing a white tee, blue jeans, no drawers, and some Nikes. My skin shines in moon, is the moon. I have no name until you name me. Let me kiss your hands. I want to taste what will end me. This next poem is part of a series of poems I wrote to explore the possibilities of empathy in the face of the typical distancing stance and reductive assessment we practice in medical care. Not only are all of us gripped ourselves by a kind of addiction to science and technology, spurred by a loss of our capacity for wonder and the need to explain everything about us, but we were also hooked on the idea of checklists and systems as solutions to the problems of our worsening lack of genuine human connection and inability to bear witness to suffering. As I hope I've conveyed through the poems I've shared this morning, opioid use is almost unimaginably more complex than any bullet list of diagnostic criteria, and empathy for people struggling and sometimes failing, sometimes at the cost of their lives, to recover from it never is just another box to check or data point to record. So this is a poem that is, again, a part of a series of broken sonnets that, of course, are love poems. And it's, the name of the series is 10 Patients in Another, and this one is called Jane Doe Number 2. They found her unresponsive in the street. Beneath a lamplight, I imagined, made her seem angelic, regal even, clean. She must have been around 16. She died who knows how many hours earlier that day, the heroine inside her like a vengeful dream about to be fulfilled. Her hands were crossed about her chest, as though raised up in self-defense. I tried to pry them open to confirm the absence of her heartbeat, but in death she was so strong, as resolute as she was beautiful. I traced the track marks on her arms instead, then pressed my thumb against her bloodless lips. So urgent was my need to know. I felt the quiet left by a departing soul. I'm going to conclude now with one last poem, but before I do, I want to thank again my fellow panelists, Susan and Rafi, for convening this wonderful forum, and of course thank all of you for being here to discuss these critically important issues. As I'm sure has been said before, we are in the midst of a health emergency. 72,000 plus Americans have died of opioid addiction this year, which is almost actually more than twice the number that were claimed last year. And of course the suffering and pain that opioid use engenders is immeasurable. So this last poem is for the people still living with substance abuse disorder, their loved ones and their care providers, and really to say how urgently they need, all of us need to be heard in this conversation. So this is a poem called Without My White Coat. I'm not a real doc without my white coat. I could be anyone, this sullen girl, some homeless person crying to himself, that addict who thinks he's got HIV. I could be anyone, this sullen girl who studies the ink stain on my white coat, that addict who thinks he gave HIV to his boyfriend, who sits in my waiting room. He studies the ink stain on my white coat. I wonder if he feels dirty too. His boyfriend, who sits in my waiting room, looked up at me hopefully. I regret my wondering. I feel dirty too, a brown-skinned imposter in my white coat. Look up, I say unhopefully, regret the burning light I shine in his dark eyes. A brown-skinned imposter in a white coat. I'm half surprised he follows my commands. The burning light I shine in his dark eyes constricts his pupils. When his tears well up, I'm not surprised. He follows the commands of human need. My white coat keeps me clean and strict before my pupil. His tears well up as carefully I draw his speechless blood. Of human need, my white coat keeps me clean, revealing very little of myself. Carefully, speechlessly, I draw his blood, a picture of the unseen soul perhaps. Revealing very little of myself, my white coat holds my shape, stands for something, a picture of the unseen soul perhaps. Perhaps it is the ghost of who I was. My white coat holds my shape, stands for something universal, love, healing, peace. I am perhaps a ghost of something that once was. I wish I could be better than I am. Universal love, healing peace. I am the homeless person crying to himself, wishing I could be better than I am. I'm not a real doc without my white coat. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing other panelists and more conversation. Thank you.